Hi everyone, welcome to another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. We have a return guest tonight, Layman Pascal. Thank you so much for being here, Layman. Yeah. Oh, yeah. uh, yeah, and
Cut.
you can hear me, right, Layman?
Can hear you. Yep.
Okay, great. So last time we talked about, a lot about shamanism in a sort of broad perspective, but I'd like to bring it down to start off tonight. Bring it down to the more practical. What here on this Discord and in this Awakening from the Meaning Crisis community, we we've been trying to implement ecologies of practices. We've been really trying to come up with take from established rituals and borrow from them, but also think about what are new rituals that we could enact in terms of serious play to help foster our perspectival and participatory ways of knowing. And I suspect that there's a lot that we can borrow from shamanistic practices, to sort of to apply to us today. For example, I understand the ancient shamans would, for example, have rituals where they would embody a bird, and that would help them with hunting as they got a better sense of how how the birds fly and how they act. And we were doing some ecstatic. We have this practice. We've started doing ecstatic dance nights here, and during one of the songs, uh, it suddenly occurred to me to try to embody a zombie. John uses the symbol of the zombie. So for that one song, I just sort of tried to act like a zombie, and I thought, there's probably something shamanistic about about this, and maybe there are things that we can borrow from shamanism uh, in our rituals today. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think one particular aspect of shamanism is what I might call proprioceptive imagination, where you try to, in a way, like harness your mirror neurons to duplicate the performative structure of some other part of the universe with the idea that you could get a more than conscious understanding of how it's operating. You increase the degree to which your nervous system is duplicating it, trying to understand posturally, physically, posturally, asana, so to speak, going on with that structure. So I think one of the things the ancient shamans tended to do was to enact this receptive imagination with the various creatures that impressed them. I think it's a very general skill. I know that John is interested in the way that some scientists have entered into a similar kind of relationship with Mars rovers. You could do it with fundamentally any structure or any pattern of information that we're working with in the universe. One of the interesting things that Einstein said was that he tried to think with his muscles. I think that's overlooked by a lot of people who are doing intellectual work or trying to understand the universe, whether that means the cosmos or their own moment in history. And what gets overlooked is the need to have a physiological, somatic, flowing engagement with the pattern that you're trying to think of, the pattern that you're trying to understand.
So what
Wow.
so what would that look like for us today? If you could bring it down just to a very practical. I don't know if you can bring it down to step by step, but if we're trying to identify such a pattern that we should embody, how should we go about trying to come up with how to do this?
Well, I would probably start small, start like the ancient shamans would have started. Start with a tree or a rock or a bird or something that you see in a very simple way every day. Try a number of different things, try to build up the skill and capacity, or you try to transpose that onto, for example, modernity might be a system. You think, wow, how could I get in touch with the animal spirit of modernity, so to speak, so that I could understand and critique it at a more than intellectual level and have to embody its patterns. But I can only do that if I've had some practice trying to embody patterns that are more viscerally available to me. I would start like the ancient shamans did, is just try to pick something in nature, try to imagine feeling and imagine doing its structure, so to speak. There's a very interesting interplay between shape and activity. One of the interesting things in terms of human sexuality is that we animals try to foreground features that are gender polarized in order to initiate mating practices. So someone might put their chest forward because that's a gender indicator in the species. But then you see somebody who's simply structurally built as if their chest is always coming forward. And a lot of people have a response to that. But what I mean to indicate by that is there's a very fuzzy line between structure and gesture and behavior. There's a thing in terms of thinking about a structure as if it was a behavior and trying to embody that behavior. And we have a system, right? We have a system of instantly duplicating the behaviors that we see. Use it all the time. We get stressed when we hear someone expressing stress, and we can tap into that system and try to treat structures that we see in the world as if they are behaviors. I know that sounds really abstract, but like I was saying, start with really simple things. If you see a tree, try to imagine what it would be like inside your own body and nervous system to do that treeing, to speak. What would the gesture be? What activity is it up to that you could duplicate? And if you get a little bit better at that skill, then you could transpose that into more abstract and sociological and technological domains.
And I guess there would be a fair amount of observation, a very careful observation first. What would the shamans do before attempting to, say, embody a bird? Would they spend a great deal of time observing just everything they could about the bird, or do you just sort of jump into it and?
That's extremely variable because everybody can milk perception in a different kind of way, right? A lot of much as you might gain new information by watching something over a while, they never gain as much increase in information as you gain in the first split second, right? In the first split second of observation, you go from zero to a whole bunch of data.
Hmm.
You might want to adumbrate that data and flesh it out and enrich it with further observations. Especially, you might want to connect with different parts of yourself, with your sensory and emotional and intellectual and subconscious responses to the perception of that phenomenon. At the same time, a lot of people might get almost everything they need or almost everything that they can get in that first split second before they even do a socialized identification process. The interesting things to me about Richard Feynman is in his autobiography, he talks about the way his father trained him to think about things. And his father would try to get him to understand objects and patterns in nature, but he refused to tell him the English word, various birds, for various trees, for things like that. He thought that knowing the name sabotaged the learning process. You know that in Feynman's case, this educational approach worked out really well. What it meant was had a lot more time before he identified the object relative to his cultural information about that object. I'd say learn a lot more, get a lot more detail, and that's very helpful. I'd say access multiple systems of your own knowledge, like sensing, feeling, and thinking, in order to get a very comprehensive knowledge. Might also say pay special attention to that split second before you identify it, before you label it, before you name it, the moment where you're getting the maximum acceleration of information, where you go from not seeing it to seeing it. That's a huge jump. Almost all of its stylistic and affect is available to you in that first moment.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We have a particular challenge here where we're trying to develop new rituals, but we're also doing it largely online. Eventually, with when COVID leaks, when COVID sort of trails off, we might be able to start having in-person meetings in various parts of the world. But for now, we're stuck online. How would a group embodying ritual? How I don't know if you could almost design one on the spot, but what might we do together through a Discord call like this, although with the video, to do this practice? So, like you said, with the tree, but do it with each other.
A couple of things come to mind immediately. The first is that everybody would need to pay attention to their own current state of embodiment, to their neurosomatic feedback circuit, right? What's going on in your physiology? What's going on in the space that you imagine inside your body? Where is the experience of your body feeding back into itself in a kind of energetic tingle sense? And how is that then responding to the individuals who are speaking and to the rest of the group? Because I think tending to that of information is very important to this process and can give you a lot of information about how to tweak what you're doing in order to tune in. At the same time, you've got to circle through everybody, right? Interesting when you have one person be the center of the speech, but if you want to do it like an ancient get-together, then everybody has to cycle through enough times for everybody to sort of feel each of the participants. And the other thing I would say is it's dangerous to overemphasize the rational. I've been in a lot of groups where people have wanted to cycle through everyone and everybody speak about, why they're here or what they're concerned about. And that's very useful. They don't also often cycle through irrational elements, right? If we say everybody say a completely meaningless thing, it would come from a different part of them. You cycled through and you had everybody make a random noise, or you had everybody try to make a surrealistic utterance of some kind. Then you'd be involving the subconscious mind of the group. You'd be telling the subconscious that it can play a role. And in terms of shamanism, you very much want subconscious intelligence.
So would that be sort of an exercise to sort of start off a session? Everyone make a sound, just any sound that comes to mind.
Absolutely, you could do it that way. I mean, I'd have a couple of minutes where everybody spent time feeling into their body. I would have everybody try to feel into their body as everyone else spoke, but then I would cycle through and you could make a noise, you could say a random thing, try to say something that doesn't make sense to you, that speaks to your feeling of the affect of the group. That maybe.
And then if we wanted to have an embodiment exercise, like the tree or an ant or the internet, can you describe how you would envision something like that in a group setting like this?
You could just pick something that probably everybody has a good mental image of. The way the ancient shamans left their marks on rock walls probably speaks to things that they found simple enough to communicate about, which is a deer, or here's a guy with a wolf head, or something like that. Here's an arrow. We all kind of have instantaneous reactions to a lot of basic animals and a lot of basic scenarios that our ancestors went through for thousands or millions of years. If you were to take something like that, right, like everybody think of jaguar, everybody think of a snake. What does a snake feel like? How do you feel when you see the snake? The snake writhe inside your body, so to speak. Let your mirror neurons activate response to the snake. You could cycle through everybody doing that. I think if you took a very simple, in a way, mythically charged, unconsciously active pattern that everybody could get in on, might be a way to move one step forward in a group ritual.
And would you have people just act it out, or would they verbalize what's going through their mind at the time?
You could do either. I mean, if you're doing it in an audio format, then their individual acting out isn't going to be available to the other members. So it would be useful for them individually, but there's this extra effect. It compounds when the other people have access to the way that you're responding to bring the group intelligence to speed. If you were just doing audio, then you would definitely want everybody to articulate something response to that phenomenon, so
And
they could get.
we would have video as well. So
Okay. Well, if you were doing video, then people could act it out. It may be easier for a lot of people to think of something and say it than it is for them to figure out how to move that way. But I would say that moving is superior to speech in a lot of ways in terms of the levels of the brain and psyche that it taps into, which is where the shamans were primarily active, right? In very deep primordial areas of the brain rather than socialized front regions of the brain.
Anything else that you would just add on this topic of coming up with our own rituals like this?
Well, you can't beat chanting. It's fantastic.
Actually, John's
I
going
mean,
to
if you
have
want to make
a lesson on chanting, I think, coming up on Monday.
just to make noise, to make rhythmic intonation sounds, and see how you are reverberating relative to others, allows you to coordinate with them, but it also is a very fundamental form of self-expression that bypasses a lot of the social limitations of the intellect.
And what so what do these, if we do these practices, I mean, what should we expect as second order effects? What do these practices afford us?
Well, immediately I would say there's two kinds of things. First is insight into whatever aspect of reality that you're focusing on. Like if you're looking at snakes or you're looking at the internet, you're looking like Einstein did at light speed, you're likely to get is some insights into that area of the universe. On the other hand, like I was saying when I was on here last time, my sense of what spiritual practice means is the coordination of the subsystems within the individual to produce a gestalt excess that can then feed back onto the individual. The second thing that you would get out of these kinds of practices is a new kind of balance between the parts of yourself. Be folding in different areas of your own psyche, different psychological and neurological subsystems would come online at the same time, be forced to interact, and therefore achieve a new kind of balance. And the benevolent side effect of effectively achieving balance of that kind is that you get a little extra, you get a bonus, you get the Gestalt resonance effect. It is intrinsically satisfying, and I think is what provides us with the energy for growth, so to speak.
And if I could actually use one last question before I get to members, what ecology of practices do you follow?
He wants to say it's eclectic. That just is a way of circuiting the attempt to do an elaborate description of all the different things I do. I try to make my life out of practice, so it would be a very involved topic to go through. I have my meditation, I have my afternoon meditation. They're quite different. I have my sexual practice, I have my breathing practice, I have my food practice, I have my physical exercise practice, I have my working with nature practice. I think the degree to which you can intentionalize your activities, use them as opportunities to provide you with the convergence of multiple internal and interpersonal factors becomes addictive and highly useful as a life. If that answers your question or not, but I don't follow a specific set. What I've done is experiment broadly with many, look for the patterns of commonality between them, take my favorites and make them compete against each other, then ultimately find ones that are largely urgent out of my own intelligence and which apply very nicely to my life.
All right, thank you. So let's go to that. That's great. That's all very helpful. Manuel, you have a question.
Yeah, so we have this running theory on the server that a lot of people in the modern world are stuck perspectively. And we're having this idea about getting them unstuck, granting them back some flexibility. And I was hoping to get your insight in how some kind of shamanic practice might leave like a profound lasting impact with the emphasis on the lasting, and then how we might use symbols in connection to this to afford these ideas.
The symbol part is, I think, subtler and more involved. The issue of practicing taking perspectives, I think, is fairly well studied as a method of enhancing human intelligence. and flexibility, getting us past the perspectives in which our culture currently finds itself. Now, some of that can be, I don't know if you know Genpo Roshi's big mind practice, or the kinds of Gestalt and internal family therapy where you take different perspectives in yourself. They're all very similar to what the shamans did, which was try to get into the perspective of different aspects of the system, spheric entities. Consider getting into the perspective of ecological entities to be a subset of the general pattern of trying to take perspectives. A lot of different ways to do that. It's extremely useful. I think it's a skill set that enables people to move past the current civilization stuckness. Even if we were to change our socioeconomic and cultural biases, would still remain stuck unless we had a very generalized capacity and interest in taking new perspectives and adapting to them. I don't know if that answers your question. Do you have a follow-up on that?
Well, so the idea would be to shock people, right, out of their current perspective, but there also needed to be like a lure, right, like some intrinsically motivating elements to keep them hooked on their new mode of being. So that's where I was trying to go with the question, and then the symbols was also something I'd like you to expand on.
Well, I think if you can get people to the place where they think their own development is the key to their feeling of power, you can convince them that taking different perspectives is going to make them stronger, make them deeper, give them more being, so to speak. I don't know that you have to trick or shock them. You just have to sell them on the idea that they are going to feel themselves more intensely if they're able to absorb these other perspectives. And in order to do that, what they have to do is listen to perspectives they don't like or that seem foreign or alien to them. In a very simple way, it could be just listening to somebody who's politically opposite from you and trying to figure out how you would justify your own values, their arguments. More elaborate way, it could be trying to see yourself through the eyes of a raven. I'm still not entirely sure what you mean by symbols, because symbols is a term that could mean a lot of different things.
So the idea would be that we wouldn't personally do it, right? Like, so we design like a game which gave affordances, right? Like, would place people in a certain relationship, and then they'd explore it. So it'd have to be engaging in some way, and it has to grab the attention of the person themselves, right? It has to be memifiable, and the symbols would be a way of having different layers of meaning being connected to similar things, right? So that idea you could integrate in the game, and you could have like a path that's around the symbol or something where you get circumambulated. That makes more sense.
That's a very interesting idea. I think if you can get people to try to speak from a perspective not their own, especially if the perspective they're trying to speak from is one that bothers them, you're in a very good position to teach their brain to know the other perspective. And if they do that, almost immediate consequence is a sense of freedom and empowerment for the individual, because the brain has now colonized a territory that they previously excluded, now own the energy that they had projected onto the other. Any system in which you could get people to try to talk from perspective that seems foreign to them, especially if it's perspective that upsets them, they're likely to be able to access an energy that will become progressively addictive to them, because that energy does increase the complexity of their being, increases the sophistication of their nervous system. They will like it if they keep doing it for a while.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Lord Dr. Doom just wants to know, what does shamanism mean to you?
Good question, Lord Dr. Doom.
Thank you.
Shamanism, it's a tricky term because for me personally, I not that interested in people who self-identify as shamans, and I'm not that interested in people who are officially designated as shamans by their indigenous group. Much more interested in shamanism as a general human phenomenon, has existed throughout history, but which, in a village sense, stands at the beginning of all human yogic and spiritual traditions. I think of shamanism as a fundamentally embodied, logically oriented, complexity adaptive form of proto-spirituality in which the basic skills that lead to religion and spirituality and human development and wisdom practices are all emergent out of human instincts within natural contexts. Reason I like that so much is that we're in a situation now that is kind of parallel or kind of a harmonic overtone to the archaic situation as a civilization where we need to repattern ourselves in relationship to ecology. We need to be much more embodied in terms of our thinking. We need to be more psychedelic in terms of our thinking. We need to be able to generate forms of ritual and consecration rather than rely on the forms that we've inherited. We need to be able to form individual search into weirdness and try to help the tribe with the results of our individual inquiry into unusual domains. I think that's a huge current need. Echoes very strongly the types of practices we can imagine were present prior to the recorded history of human spirituality and religion and mental practice. And so for me, shamanism means that original state, also the way in which the capacities of that original state apply to our current situation.
That is fascinating. Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up? Just to
Please.
clarify something? Okay. So I've been into philosophy for a multitude of reasons. I want to understand the universe, first of all, but then once I started learning from people like Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, I became very interested in existential philosophy. And I think that touches exactly on what shamanism is, that embodied experience. So do you have any philosophical, existential elements to that, like in the form of practice? Like what would that look like in a form of practice to you, and say maybe your favorite sense of practice in an existential sense?
Not sure entirely because my favorites shift constantly. Operating with that flow the way a surfer operates with the water is very important to me. So I don't want to necessarily privilege any one thing as my favorite type of practice, but I would say that if you take your internal work to nature as much as you can, if you make sure that the overall sensation of the inside of your body is a factor in any of your practices, if you were doing any kind of meditation, the total interior simultaneity of sensation within the body irrelevant to you, your subconscious information system be something that's always on the tip of your tongue, that you should always be thinking that there's a part of you that's either smarter than you or can provide some information that you don't currently have, and you are templatively available to that information and looking for information, whether it makes immediate rational sense to you or not. I think those two things are features that I work into a lot of my practices, as well as trying to do as much as I can with nature, with the biosphere, in the forest, in the water. Obviously, one of the things that shamanic traditions around the world have focused on is psychological effect of elemental powers. That means, very simplistic way, earth, air, water, and fire. The Asian system is a little bit different, but to make physical contact and to immerse yourself in and smoke and water and foam and wind and forest, lake and river, all those kind of things provide a tremendous reset to the human organism and tremendous opportunity to apply our other meditative and contemplative exercises. If that makes any sense.
Wow, yeah, that is utterly fascinating. I really like it's completely enlightened to me because you didn't choose like the having mode. Like you're in this meta sense where you don't have just one practice. Like the practice to you is the fact that you're going in and out of multiple practices and constantly shifting and reintegrating. So I really like that. Thank you.
Just want to come back to something you just said and see if I'm reading something in, or just to make sure. You said you weren't too interested in the people today who call themselves shamans, and I didn't know if there was some sort of negative tinge there, or some sort of implied accusations of being charlatans or not being real, so to speak, there.
It's just that I don't know. So in any given circumstance, I have no reason to believe anyone who asserts themselves as a shaman is more or less likely than anyone else to be a shaman. Do I have any reason to believe anyone who is asserted by their tribe to be a shaman is more or less likely than anyone else to be a shaman? They could be, might not be. I just don't think that self-assertion or officialization, like social sanction, whether it's a certificate you get after your shamanism retreat weekend, or whether it's an endorsement you get from your tribe in the Amazon, I don't think social officialization a good basis for determining who's actually embodying shamanic intelligence. Just don't know. So I don't have a negative opinion about it. I have a negative opinion about it as a validation approach. May or may not be what I mean.
So what do you look for to figure out if somebody is more authentic, so to speak?
I think it's a very rich phenomenon. So you have to get to know somebody, right? I'm looking for things like person who lives in a way that passes through a lot of different states of consciousness. Looking for someone who is deeply involved with what we might metaphorically refer to as natural powers, but who's always looking for something deeper in the phenomenon. Looking for someone whose spirituality is embodied, looking for someone who's psychedelically intelligent to some degree, looking for someone who is trying to bring their rational intellect together with their subconscious prompts, looking for someone who is constantly moved to try to bring their successes in terms of personal development and state change into harmony with their personal tribe, their network of individuals who they think they can provide something to. All of that are ways of looking at an organic shaman, so to speak, rather than a socially designated.
Mark, you have a question.
Sure. Well, I think we were having a conversation yesterday with Tim Adelin, and one of the things he mentioned actually were shamans, and the fact that there are groups where even if they're warring, the shaman can, in the middle of the war, go between the tribes without falling prey to the tribal tendencies for war, for example. And so I'm sort of wondering at that point what the connection is between shamanism and sacredism, or the sacred, and what we can sort of learn and integrate, in terms of shamanic practices to a group. And maybe you could comment a little on how having one shaman can service a group of people, even in different tribes, for example, and what that relationship sort of looks like to you.
That's a great question. I think it has a couple of different components, and one of them is the shaman has a socially elevated position in the ancient cultures, right? The same way that lamas had a socially elevated position in the Himalayas for 1,000 years. There are forms of human society in which the people that are involved in these practices, these wisdom cultivating practices, given a special protected and elevated status and are involved in the regular political and economic activities of the society as special observer commentators. People say that democracy goes back to the poet philosopher Solon in ancient Athens. So there's this tremendous tendency of societies to accord special status of insight to these characters. I think society tends to get off track, doesn't try to involve these characters as fundamental participants in the decisions that the society is making. The other side of it is people who undergo perspectival enrichment. It's taking the perspective of someone you hate, or taking the perspective of a non-human animal, the internet, or the forest, or the world, or the gods. That person tends, after a while, evolve to a new level of richness in terms of what their basic approach to other human beings is. A person who stands in a kind of transcendental perspective position relative to their own tribe can also stand in that position relative to another tribe. From Freud, we've tended to get an idea that maybe some of the mystics throughout history were people who had particular neuropathologies. Mircea Eliade, some of the other early scholars of shamanism, found that the shamans, even in very indigenous situations, were typically the people in the tribe had the most experiences, the greatest linguistic capacity, and the highest intelligence. Very often, the shaman in a given social context is the one who is capable of instinctively holding higher perspectives that transcend that context and include it in juxtaposition with other contexts. In the sense that a person who was world-centric in their sensibility come down on either side of an ethnocentric nationalistic dispute. I think the shaman, by virtue of perspective-taking practice, come to occupy a supra-perspectival position that's applicable not just to their own tribe, but to multiple tribes, and hypothetically is applicable to every side of every dispute.
Wow, that's interesting. One thing that sort of came to mind there is that, oh boy, I'm gonna go here. I think is that it sounds like in some ways our idea of IQ and intelligence in the Western world has hijacked some of the features of shamanism, and so we're to some degree holding the science class in a shamanic regard when it's not appropriate, because that's only one dimension to the shamanic experience, and it's actually the other dimension in some sense that's more important, the ability to do the perspectival switch rather than the high regard for the mental capacity, we'll call it, in the propositional space. And it seems like we have some confusion around that. How does that make you feel?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would think that the way we've done IQ for the last little while, for the modernity period, so to speak, that we've hyper-focused on things that were adaptive intellectual capacities in terms of the technological and market-driven circumstances in which we find ourselves. But I think that's a derivation and a specialization from the generalized development of intelligence. Generalized development of intelligence is development of perspectives and the development of intelligence on our multiple different intelligence systems, whether in the Howard Gardner sense or the Ken Wilber sense or just the heart, mind, and body sense. We have all these different intelligence systems. And if we work on all of them, we can develop a generalized sense of higher intelligence. And I think that the ancient shamans were the people in their tribes with the greatest degree of generalized intelligence. What we currently think of as IQ is somewhat of a specialized subset of generalized.
Yeah, that's excellent. That gives me a lot to chew on, and it has some interesting tie-ins with some of the current discussions we have going on here. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
So we live in a skeptical age, where respect for some of the ancient traditions have lapsed. Let's say, what do you say to the modern skeptic who sort of scoffs at these types of ancient practices and thinks, what do I have to learn from these Stone Age practices?
I'd approach it in a couple of ways. First of all, I would say these people aren't skeptical enough. They're not yet skeptical of their own metaphysical assumptions. My thinking is generally post-metaphysical, but that doesn't just mean on traditional cosmological mythology. It also means beyond the sort of background assumptions that characterize modernity and theistic science as well. That a lot of these things are still undecided. Even the notion of fundamental decidability is problematic. So we have to be very basically agnostic and skeptical in a lot of ways and have a good conscience about that. So I would say to the skeptic, they should become even more skeptical. I would also say that human biomachinery is roughly constant over the period of human history. That we may be in different informational and social circumstances now than our archaic ancestors were, but we have fundamentally the same physiology and the same neurophysiology, and therefore the same basic needs and capacities that they did. Might have been in uniquely good circumstances to harness those capacities, circumstances that we don't necessarily have. For example, if you wanted to integrate all of the things you understood to one whole, you would have a better chance of doing that if you only knew 1,000 things, if you knew 1,000,000 things. There are ways in which more primitive world spaces would provide human beings who have the same biomachinery as us a heightened opportunity to bring themselves together, to coordinate themselves, to access peak experiences, to rise to the heights of what they're capable of, a way that people who have a much richer and more complicated information and social universe would have a much harder time doing.
Do you see shamanistic practices like coming back, or do you see? Are you optimistic about that possibility?
I see fragments of it coming, merging from all kinds of directions, right? The reason we're having this discussion is it's coming up for me, but not just for me, it's coming up for you guys, right? So the way John talks about embodiment as a fundamental feature of cognitive science, the way all kinds of different spiritual teachers are focusing more on emotion and embodiment than maybe they did 100 years ago, the way that we are all socially hyper attuned to the fact that we are accordant with the patterns of organic complexity that make the ecosystem run, the way that psychedelics and altered states of consciousness are becoming decriminalized and renormalized in therapy, in art, in philosophy, and spirituality. A lot of very optimistic signs that something that will eventually converge on a new humanism is bubbling up all over the place.
Yeah, and I think John's course is what brought me back to having a respect for these these ancient traditions. So hopefully we can play our part in that as well. Factually,
A lot of
sorry, go ahead.
a lot of very simple ways. There was a study. The details escape me at the moment, but there was a German town that was tested in the 1800s for visual and auditory acuity in students. So 100 years later, they thought it would be good to retest them. Turned out that all of the students at the same grade level had significantly diminished in auditory and visual acuity. And when they tried to theorize why that might be, their guess was that these kids were more exposed to human technological environments where sounds and colors were very simple and tailored to immediate reception by the human sense organs, right? We make a red sign or we make a blue and yellow sign. We make things simple to see because we want to communicate this information. 100 years ago, people had less of that kind of signaling system and much more access to immersion in natural circumstances, which are highly complex. If you go into the woods and try to follow a line visually, it ends up skewing and splicing and branching. End up looking at 1,000 different shades of green. You end up hearing noises that are on the edge of your ability to recognize. There's this sense in which logically embedded organic complexity, fundamental driver of our internal development and our intelligence, that if we fall too much into simplified human social patterning, lose a huge range of richness in terms of capacity and experience. I think it's a very simple way of looking at what shamanic experience has to bring back to us, which is not only the full richness of what we're capable of, the actual patterning of the organic complexity of the universe in which we are embedded and from which we have sort of temporarily insulated ourselves over the past few hundred years and through very simplified human thought systems.
Excellent. Factfully, you have a question.
Thank you. I think I would characterize myself as a skeptic relative to I suppose, the spiritual claims of people I've met who are shamans or purport to be shamans or who make claims about shamanism. But I have a general respect and I value traditions which have expressed many of the features that you've talked about, which are perhaps lapsed from contemporary human cognition. And so the question that I ask, although it may in some sense sound uncharitable, is in the spirit of seeking to understand a way in which such traditions can be preserved and respected. So I just want to lay that as the groundwork. It seems to me that shamanism and wisdom traditions, things like it, have been more or less obliterated from contemporary life, and they've been outcompeted by other sorts of ideas and other ways of being. Perhaps a lot has been lost there. My concern remains the same today, that if in a world which may become increasingly fractious, where there are wars being fought over particular belief systems, they are inculcated into their subscribers so that they form efficient combative groups. Often there are very specific strategies about causing their adherents not to think of other worldviews, not to consider other perspectives. And so those sorts of highly self-convinced worldviews, they tend to be extremely effective in confederating people towards utopian ideals, which appear utopian only in so much as they haven't considered or brooked their possible downsides. These sorts of views have tended to outcompete others in history. And things like the facets of shamanism that you mentioned, perspective taking, things which may be enriching, it tend to weaken groups when it comes to all-out combat, an all against all war of ideas, and perhaps even a war which becomes violent or military, or even which just becomes rhetorically combative. And so my question is, how does a more rounded philosophy and a more rounded enrichment of the self, which is less likely to fight to the death in support of a simplistic utopian notion. How does it survive against those ideas? How do we ensure that the arrow of history doesn't just reemerge to exterminate this, as you said, you consider hopeful signs of a rekindling?
People are always going to be tempted to take hits and solutions, whether it's ideological or whether it's, say, dietary, right? Everybody with children knows how easy it is for them to converge on rapidly metabolizable sugars that might not be good for them. There's always a maturational struggle between what's good for us and the kinds of skills and capacities we need to be unfolding over time as a result of a life of practice, the way we are immediately tempted to converge on something that's simplistic. Converging on something that's simplistic in terms of idea space always going to be extremely tempting when we are under stress and deprivation conditions. So that people falling back on simplistic and totalitarian winner-take-all mindsets, it's a very natural extension of the way that we've set up our governmental and economic systems around the world. And as long as you have those pressures on people, they're going to tend to follow really dumb, condensed, contractive, degenerative versions of these idea systems. In order for people to take these practices as growth practices, for them to duplicate what think went on with the archaic shaman in order to become more perspectively rich, more complex, deeper, more satisfied with your beingness, more capable of accessing the variety of multidimensional capacities that are within you, capable of contributing to a society that moves forward qualitatively and the anthropological and the ecological into more balance. In order to do that, you have to be depressurized enough to do that. If the pressure is on, right? If somebody comes into your house with a gun, you're not that worried about your shamanic developmental practices. You've got to deal with the emergency. The degree to which we've set up people to feel like they're in an emergency, then they're going to use the degenerative version rather than the developmental version of any idea system.
Right. Yes, I do take that point. But it does seem that this emerged out of cultural coevolution. So long before we'd set up modern societies, these ideas began to be extinguished. So yeah, I agree with everything you said about that's the pathology. How do we, do you think, avoid it in a world, let's say, where there are reawakenings, or let's say the harnessing of religious idealism to shape groups into conflict, and particular religious idealisms which have a particular answer, a particular way to get to heaven, and which have previously formed great empires, and there's kind of a revanche to reform these things, and governments around the world, to at least three that I can think of, are using them as ways to sort of reform empires. How in that world are these ideas best defended? I think I agree with the pathology. I think you describe it well. How do we best defend what's subtle and precious and exploratory about these things in the metaphorical world in which, yes, a stranger is in your house and they may have a gun?
I tend to think of religion myself as the result of the compatible integration of the different genres operating in a society in a given epoch. For me, the danger is not so much religion that's adapted to previous historical, technological, and knowledge epochs. And I think one of the problems we face today is that we aren't sufficiently religionizing the current knowledge universe. So people feel the tremendous lack of meaning, and they tend to regress back towards a previous knowledge universe that they felt was massively integrated. They're looking for that massive resonant integration of all the dimensions of life. can't get it at the current level of complexity, they'll very naturally roll back to a simpler level of complexity. That is, the general supportive conditions are missing, right? If they are in a better situation physically, better situation emotionally and mentally, health-wise, biologically, culturally, more information, more education, fundamentally more experience from childhood onward of engaging in growth practices and of understanding themselves, wanting to understand themselves, to get organic self-esteem, trying to embrace things that are different than themselves. So there's a whole lifestyle pattern that's needed in order to support people in a way that they could fundamentally make that decision. We're always going to be at risk, as we were at every period in the past, at risk of pathology and degeneration. We have to provide, on the one hand, the supportive conditions, and on the other hand, the kinds of intentional developmental practice that help people grow beyond that. And the people who have done that can act as sort of anchors, which create a social space, which encourage other people to do that. It's always going to be a danger. And it's not just religion, it's any set of ideas whatsoever operate in this degenerative and pathological and totalitarian fashion. What we need to do is set up the deliberate life of practice, but also the range of supportive sociological, physiological, and political conditions that enable people to depressurize, look for the growth pathways rather than the stress reaction pathways.
Great. Thanks very much.
Manuel, you have a question.
We've been trying to struggle with the idea of charisma on the server, and I think it's related to being in contact with your authentic self, but I also think there's a lack of at least healthy charismatic people in modern society. So do you see any relationship to shamanism, and do you have any ideas about how to cultivate charisma as a skill?
Charisma is a complex area, right? Obviously an aspect of it that is simply performative. Anybody could adapt themselves to a form of public acting, would come across as charismatic to others. And often a lot of people we are charismatic as celebrities are actually very sad, depressive looking characters when you examine them closely. I always found Robin Williams very charismatic, but when you look at photos of him and you see this big smile, you have an immediate response to his performative gesture of smiling. You look a little closer. If you look at his eyes and ignore your first reaction, you can easily see the level of depression there that led to his suicide and some of his other behaviors. Part of it is just performance. Part of it is physiology. People whose bodies are healthy in that kind of therapy sense, and bodies that allow stimulation patterns to move more thoroughly through all their organs, be related to Kundalini practice in the East. Bodies that allow more electricity to move through them have a certain additional liveliness, have a certain capacity to relate to their own electric fields differently. Sometimes charisma is performance. Sometimes charisma is the projection of the audience onto someone who just represents something they're interested in. Sometimes charisma is more physiologically and emotionally authentic. In our fantasy idea of what a great archaic shaman was, we could say that's what they partly were, was someone who was open, someone who was available to the other, someone who had dealt with their own shadow material, someone who had recovered all of the latent pseudo-electrical charge that's available to their own body, and they have it with them rather than having it projected, repressed, suppressed. A lot of us think someone is charismatic. They acting in a way that represents an idea that we like, and we project our energy onto them as we aren't in command of our own stimulation patterns, or that we can own our own reactions and let that excitation move through us. the more we're capable of being a distributed community of fairly charismatic people, rather than non-charismatic people who are obsessively projecting their own latent charisma onto a performer of some kind.
So I was really caught by this idea of performance, and the way I envision it is that there's a space that's generated by the crowd, right? Like a potential resonance, and that maybe there's the performance is like a shamanistic embodiment of that resonance, and that you could play with it, right? You could steer it into the correct direction by staying true to yourself and to the world, I guess. So you can focus that energy in a generative way. Is that resonating with you?
Different ways to do it productively. Obviously, if we were participatorily, consciously involved in a situation where we knew that we were projecting our energy onto a guru of some kind, and he was feeding that energy back to us as well as critiquing our tendency to project ourselves onto him, it could be a really useful circumstance. Very often that's not the circumstance, and we have to have our own critique and responsibility of our tendencies to project our energy onto the other. The surplus energy of the other, which was added to our perception of them, is actually occurring within us. We need to be able to locate that within us as a stimulation pattern so we can take possession of it for our own development. One of the major problems in terms of the previous question about regression versus development in social systems and individuals is when you have enough energy in yourself, then you have the energy to undergo development, many new things and building them into your definition. If you don't have energy, you become very starvation oriented, scarcity oriented. You want to fall back to a kind of purity and simplicity because you don't have the energy to unfold diversity into your new self-definition. I think that we need to be aware when we deal with people who appear charismatic, need to be able to critique them and ask ourselves whether or not that person is actually what we mean charismatic to be, or whether the charisma we're looking at is our own charisma being offloaded from ourselves onto our imaginary idea of them. Could work, right? I think a lot of historical rituals involved someone taking the spot of the group projection, getting that back to you. That's also a very risky situation because they might not handle it right, might impinge you into the pattern of projection rather than into the pattern of receiving and consuming and feeding on your own stimulation.
So I'm really interested in that distinction between feeding the shadow basically and be channeling it into constructive way. Can you expand on that?
I think the most basic skill has to do with somatic sensing. If we're looking at the person or idea or system we find to be radiant and charismatic, should be paying attention inside our own bodies to the stimulation patterns that go along with that perception. Locate the feelings of excitation along with the perception. We're in a pretty good spot to be able to start working with that excitation in ourselves. We don't feel ourselves, and all we do is confront radiant or charismatic or fascinating person or idea. We're very close to a form of hypnosis, which is 50-50, whether it's going to turn out to be good for us or destructive for us.
Yeah, that's interesting information. I'll need to chew on that. Thanks.
Well, surely the ratio isn't always 50-50.
I just mean that it's a gamble. Like any time you were to go, I do hypnotherapy, and anytime you put yourself in, you allow yourself to go into a trance that someone else is guiding, you're taking a risk. You have to trust them, have some reason to believe that the trance they enable you to go into is going to be useful for you rather than diluting, misleading for you. You have to use other criteria to make the evaluation.
Right. So doing hypnotherapy, I'm assuming you offer that as a service then? Or do you have the sense then that it's worthwhile to spend an extended period of time getting to know them and have them get to trust you before you perform the service, or is it something that can be done in a relatively short period of time?
Depends a lot upon the individual. I would prefer they spent more time. For some people, their need is much more urgent and they're much more willing to take the risk.
Yeah.
I tend to do it in a certain way that satisfies my own conscience, which is I try to do as little directing as possible, but I can feel secure about how I work with them. Sense is that there's an intelligence in the unconscious, in the trance state itself, I can evoke in them, and it will guide them rather than telling me their problem and me hypothetically helping them out with it, right? I mean, hypothetically in the sense that they have no absolute reason to believe I'm going to be helpful. But what I try to do is them in touch with a part of themselves that's smarter than they are.
Yes, right. That's exactly how I describe it here very often. That there's obviously something going on in there that demonstrates extraordinary capacity. You see it isolated from time to time in things like idiot savants or, some profound cognitive function. And, it's certainly demonstrated in like psychedelic experience, right? Where there's some kind of self-organizing re-understanding of the world that's presented in some strange way. But yeah, like really to let people become unafraid of speaking what they truly desire and then presenting to that desire in a receptive way. They seem to work it out themselves.
World that we're in right now, it verges on such chaos and complexity in every direction. Whether it's the absolute mass weirdness of what's going on, the level of the economy and politics and civilization, whether it's the increasing discoveries of chaos science and complexity science and computational irreducibility and vast scales of the universe that we can barely comprehend, the complexity of the situation we face is overwhelming. And we need our intelligence systems that are better than us, so to speak. And that means collective intelligence, computational intelligence, and subconscious intelligence. Those all are only effective when we can encourage them to actually operate at a level that's more sophisticated than we are.
Right. Yeah, the full stack. Yeah, I think it's vital that this is kind of like an educational protocol, right? Like to be plugged into each of this in terms of understanding how they interrelate and becoming proficient at the tools that are used at each of those layers. I think that is what produces a functionally well-rounded individual in the information ecosphere that we've got. So,
despite the kinds of dogmatic and sectarian violence that have been associated with religion over the years, there's something deeply religious about all these forms of higher intelligence.
Yeah.
The collective relative to the individual and the subconscious relative to the conscious, mutational relative to our linear capacity to understand things. There's a huge gap of mystery. It's almost like each one of these areas is an area in which we have to cross a mystery in order to deal with a superintelligence. It's the fundamental pattern brought forward in religions over human history.
Yeah, my computer frequently evokes the feeling of awe, but just as often I curse it. So, thanks a lot for doing this, by the way.
This is great. These are fantastic questions, and everybody seems really sincere and engaged. So,
yeah, yeah, I've been consistently impressed by the people that show up in these places. A lot of them.
Yeah, well, this has been another fascinating hour, and yeah, thank you again for coming. I feel there's just like a deep well of information to dive into every time we speak, and uh, you know, well, I guess I should ask: are there any resources you could recommend? You know, for learning a little bit more about shamanism today, and I don't know if there's some good YouTube series or any books you would recommend for people.
One ad, I would say read the classics, read Mircea Eliade, read Terence McKenna, people like that. More fundamental than accessing those resources, say, go into nature, be immersed in the ecosystem. Do it with drugs, do it with drumming, with trances, do it with whatever you can, but go out there, hybrid state of consciousness, and try to make contact with elements of the biosphere. Learn so much more than you would learn from a book or a YouTube series. Your own conclusion.
So we have some more practices to come up with. We can have our nature exploration practices as well. Again, thank you so much for this. This has been great. We'd love to have you back anytime. I thank everybody for the fantastic questions, and I'm always so grateful that you all come to these events. We'll be uploading it to YouTube, so please everyone subscribe to our YouTube channel. And remember, John's going to be back here on Monday for another for his biweekly Q&A. And make sure to subscribe to our Google Calendar, because we have tons of events pretty well every day. So please please make sure you keep up with everything that we're doing. So thanks again, Layman. This has been just a wonderful hour.
My pleasure. I'm happy to come back sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant.
Yeah, thanks.